Hello, my name's V. Pollock and I'm Dean of Culture and Creative Arts at Newcastle University. Last year we had the pleasure and privilege of welcoming Maria Balshaw, Director of the Tate, to Newcastle to give the Charlton Lecture as part of our Insight series. And now is a really interesting moment to reflect upon some of the issues that Maria raised with us. Maria spoke to us about the fast pace of change within public museums and art galleries, and in many ways about the expanded role such institutions now play. She spoke to us about Tate's Year 3 project with the artist Steve McQueen, and this was a project enacted at a time when several individuals and organisations were raising pressing concerns about the perceived lack of value given to culture and creative arts within the English education system. Shortly after Maria's lecture, Tate launched a press release advocating for an arts-rich curriculum in England. What Maria spoke to us about was what public museums and art galleries do within, but also out with their walls to engage, to inspire, and also to challenge. In our current crisis, these two things, the value of creative education and the wider role that our cultural sector plays, have come to the fore. Whether it's homeschooling with arts education packs from cultural venues, arts organisations and artists, or illustrated books helping children and young people understand what's happening in the wider world. The arts are helping young people through and encouraging them to think differently. And this engagement is vitally important, because if we are going to tackle global challenges and the wicked problems that we face, we need curious, creative thinkers of the future with buckets of empathy and who are not afraid to take risks and learn from failure, all of which can be learned through engaging with culture and creative arts. Streamed theatre, live performances online, virtual tours of museums, music festivals from musicians' front rooms, crafting. All of these things are helping us through the current situation, challenging our thinking, offering escapism, helping us deal with loneliness and isolation. At a human level, the strength and love the sector is showing its audiences is very real. And yet this sector, one of the largest contributors to UK PLC, to our economy, is in other ways extremely fragile. Margins are small, many artists are freelancers, venues need audiences to survive. The current pandemic is placing the sector under huge stress and threat, and that is likely to have significant implications for our economy. So as we listen to Maria's lecture, it's timely to reflect on how we value culture and creative arts, on the role we want it to play in our lives and those of our children and young people, and how we as audiences can play a part in shaping and supporting the sector through and after the current crisis. I hope you enjoy the lecture.
Good evening, everyone. It's very, very nice to be here in Newcastle, not least because my son is doing an MA here. I'll embarrass him at the beginning of the lecture. I'm glad he's come to hear me. Tate and art history and museums is what I'm going to touch on this evening, but I'm going to begin with a bit of history about Tate. So my office is near to the original Tate, the one that many of us, if we are 50 or older, grew up going to when we were in London. Tate began its life as a fledgling national museum of British art, opened in 1897 on the site of London's most infamous prison at Millbank. It was created as part of a Victorian Act of Cultural Development that was part of the development of an ambitious capital city. So along with institutions like the V&A, the Natural History Museum, the Science Museum, and also the National Gallery, which helped make Trafalgar Square, it was part of Victorian efforts to secure pure a British history of art, and the presence of international art in a city that wanted to be global. Tate pursued a British first, it was the little sister really of the National Gallery, and then a modern international collecting building agenda in this building for nearly 100 years. It didn't always have the queer and now banner, that was a later addition. Its first foray outside London was part of an explicit agenda fostered by Michael, now Lord Heseltine, to jumpstart Liverpool out of post-industrial decline after riots in the city. So to allow the riches by then of the National Art Collection to go to the docks in Liverpool with the creation of the second Tate. You know, this was an early example of the things that you see here in Newcastle with the Baltic and the Sage and so forth. Tate Liverpool was the first Tate that I got to know because I arrived as a student there the year that it opened. So I arrived and my parents took me for my goodbye meal down at the newly restored docks, and the first thing I encountered when I walked in was Dali's lobster telephone. I was hooked, and you could say it's where I began the journey to where I've ended up now. The collections on display in Tate Liverpool at that time, however, were primarily, probably exclusively, I wasn't paying that much attention because I was an 18-year-old student, but they would have been primarily European and North American, white and largely male artists. The same was true of the curriculum I encountered on the English literature degree, which prompted me to move towards cultural studies that was beginning to thrive on the campus, where I encountered feminist and critical theory and the beginnings of Black British cultural studies, which very rapidly made an impact on who and what was taught on campus, and certainly made a profound impact on me. But it was only really out in the city of Liverpool, at the intersection of community and artistic practice and new media work, that I found things like the Video Positive Festival, which then became the Liverpool Biennial, and it was these things that gave me a sense that my lived experience and cultural interests might actually be the stuff of art. Elsewhere, however, in the cultural world, things were in motion. So if we fast forward 12 years, it was the conversion of a power station on the Thames that brought Louise Bourgeois' Spider to the edge of the river, and also to the newly restored turbine hall at Tate Modern. Then, or before Tate Modern's arrival, a rather desolate part of Southwark. I remember studying at the Poetry Library in the South Bank Centre, probably 1993, and a walk down towards where Tate Modern is not something you would have done then. Now, you just have to walk slowly because there's a lot of people. So Louise Bourgeois' Maman arrives, and Tate was built. This is the, you can see the original part there. This is the second and newer part. It was predicted to attract 125 or 1.25 million people, and it saw 5.25 million visitors in its first year. The niche sport of contemporary art, kind of fencing, if you like, was fast becoming athletics in terms of its popularity, and the public were almost moving faster than the museums world. So, in the light of that expansion in public interest, Tate Modern has recently become twice as big, and we have the Blavatnik building as well as the original boiler house. And in the first year of the expanded Tate Modern, we saw 6.5 million people visit. That expansion of Tate changed London. It made it a global centre for contemporary art, and in doing so, it made contemporary art part of the mainstream life of a world city. Tate's expansions also changed the art world itself and the art history that we now know, making it, I would argue, less elite, more conscious of its role in shaping the public sphere and public opinion. And in creating Tate Modern, Tate actively chose to change the art histories that had been told, to make them less white and Western, to begin to re-gender the canon, or break the canon up, and to embrace diverse centres of art that have emerged across the globe through the 20th and now 21st century. When my colleague Frances Morris arrived at Tate, she is now director of Tate Modern, but she arrived there in 1989 as a curator. She remembers documents written by the then director of collection, writing that he considered the collection, the modern collection, nearly complete. When she worked on the first hang for Tate Modern in 2000, Tate broke the mould of chronological star works and major art movements, hanging thematically, and it began to break the conventions around the absence of women and the absence of non-Western art. But even in 2000, she tells me there were still only 3 women artists in that first hang. The new Tate Modern started a programme which has seen the collection change beyond all recognition. We now have work from every continent across the globe, a much more dynamic, diverse representation of work within Tate Modern, and in the most contemporary portions of the gallery, 50-50 men and women, and why shouldn't there be? So we've seen this change fundamentally in the past 19 years. However, I feel we are barely at the beginning of the changes and the motion that we will continue to see and need to help foster. So we see this at Tate as an active and continuing roles as we think about the meanings of historic collections, those that were originally part of Tate's holdings, formed through imperial wealth and might. What do these mean now in a contemporary post-colonial world? And in which ways are art and artists informed by contemporary debates about identity, power dynamics, and the politics of culture? So the transformations that Tate went through, and the City of London went through, and the art world has gone through, are not only about built infrastructure, or even about the art itself. There have also been significant shifts in how people come to engage with art. The tipping point, it's widely acknowledged, was 3 years after Tate Modern opened with Olafur Eliasson's Weather Project. My son was 5 years old at that point, and can still remember lying on the floor, making shapes with his body and becoming part of the work of art. Olafur's project in the Turbine Hall with its mirrors on the ceiling was an invitation to make an art action in response to a sun, and it forever changed how the public engage with the invitation that is any artwork. We see this at Tate Modern in the legacy of a Friday night. There's Olafur's thing, I've forgotten I put that slide in. That looks like this now, each time we have a late opening. The 4 buildings are now, we hope, thriving spaces for art and also for people. By embracing the idea that art and artists and audiences have a radical role to play in shaping the art and the institutions that we want to see in the future, I think Tate has begun to explore what a more open and collaborative institution could look like in our cities and in our towns. Because I should say, as Tate is doing this, of course, the galleries and museums across the UK, here in Newcastle, are also part of this dialogue. It is definitely not only a London story, even for Tate. We see it also in Liverpool and St Ives, very far away from the particular pressures and opportunities of being in a capital city. So, over the past 18 months, we've seen the beautiful expansion and refurbishment of Tate St Ives, which I am proud to say, it's another Tate Modern one, this is it, which I'm proud to say won UK Museum of the Year in 2018. The accolade was not so much for building, although as you can see empty here, Jamie Fogart's gallery spaces are very beautiful, but rather it was because of an enlightened capital development that combined long-running, ground-up building of community and culture in the Stuart Hall or Raymond Williams sense of that word. Tate came to St Ives originally because of its long association with artists that had helped shape the language and form of international modernism. It was, as an institution, however, not really welcomed initially. Much suspicion about Tate's down from London thinking, And why shouldn't people be suspicious of that? But over 2 decades, the institution has rooted itself into the town and into Cornwall and helped sustain the contemporary artist ecology, the wider creative landscape, as well as the tourist industry that is now so important to that part of the world. And it's done so by listening to people and by giving local communities a space to shape their own ideas and events, using Tate's collections, as well as through a residency programme for artists that brings them again into that community. This is what the Museum of the Year prize money is being used to develop. An artist-led community strategy that is anchored in an expanded building, but spreads its activities across the town and across all of Cornwall, based on ideas that come from that place. So, a beautiful example in the middle of winter was found by the actions of an artist who took a Cornish tradition of throwing a silver ball into the sand in front of the galleries. The children of the town were supposed to find the silver ball and they get a prize. The ball that Tate St Ives created was bigger than this. And it was rolled around every part of Tate St Ives by an increasingly large crowd of the community. It started its journey in a part of St Ives where the residents don't see the gallery as theirs. And it's the beginning of a dialogue about how we can go to other people's places in order to bring them in. So most of the examples I've talked to you about so far began with capital projects, but as you can probably tell, I want to emphasise that capital regeneration on its own is never the whole answer, even if we in the cultural sector are often quite beguiled by building buildings or expanding them or changing them. And Tate's various expansions, however, have always been about working with and building communities, as well as creating bricks and mortar. So a social model of regeneration. And it's all about expanding the narratives that we then tell within and beyond those institutions. I want to share you a current example of that expansion of narratives. Now we are 19 years into expanding the histories we tell. So you'll see this next week if you come to Tate, so you're kind of getting ahead of time images today. We are doing a display. Curator of Latin American art is doing a display called 1973, drawn entirely from our collection. This date is of particular significance for Latin America, and in particular for Chile. It is the year that Allende's government was overthrown by Pinochet, bringing in a military dictatorship, which had huge ramifications for the whole continent, but also saw major resistance from artists of that region. The display includes works by Cecilia Hakuna. Here you see the Precarious book and a resistance banner. Her words inspired me. She said, "In the beginning, I made work to try to prevent the coup. Now the objects intend to support armed struggle against the reactionary government. The objects try to kill 3 birds with 1 stone, politically, magically, and aesthetically." Alongside Cecilia's work, one sees Artists for Democracy and a collection of apilleres, textile works made by anonymous women artists who work as part of a collective. They are quite extraordinary things. I want us to hold in mind that even 5 years ago, these works would have been very unlikely to have been seen as eligible for Tate's collection. The V&A, of course, collects textiles, not Tate. Nor would the social activism that's represented in this 1973 display necessarily have fitted easily into art historical narratives. Tate has, in recent years, speedily and successfully not only expanded its connections to parts of the world, but expanded the way that we think about the collection and the ways in which we will talk about that with the public. I should say we have very far to go still in terms of representing non-white artists, never mind artists who might be recognised as Indigenous practitioners, as part of our evolving collection and histories. But we have begun this journey, and it is bringing enthusiastic and disputatious response from the audiences, just as it should. And we can see, and this is my MoMA example, we can see how influential this kind of approach has been if we look to the recently expanded MoMA. And I find this very exciting. So MoMA opened twice as large in its mid-Manhattan location only a couple of weeks ago. And if you Google the coverage after this lecture, what you will see is a conversation about the way in which MoMA has broken with its own art historical traditions. So they have wonderful Picassos. They have many more stellar 20th century iconic works that we have in Tate's collection. But in the new hang at the new MoMA, you see Picasso hung alongside a textile work by Faith Ringgold, the African-American artist. This work was included in an exhibition that Tate did in the first 6 months of my time there, called Soul of a Nation. It began before I arrived, but it is an African-American show that told a history that is familiar to me from my academic background. Faith's work was a very significant part of that show, and at that point in time, MoMA was actively collecting across the world to bring works into the collection that would bolster its representation of non-white, non-Western artists. I feel delighted and honoured for Tate that this went from Tate's exhibition into the MoMA collection and now is in the redisplays. And as you walk around the expanded MoMA, what you see is a diversity of work, conversations across race, gender, across time, across medium. So there is much more design, there is textile work, there is architecture speaking to art. And that feels very much of the time that we are in now. And as Glenn Lowry described, it makes the collection in its diversity the main story. So I think what we are beginning to see is not, as some people said about Soul of a Nation, that, oh, this will be a one-off. We're moving beyond the one-off demonstrations of the importance of African American art or Latin American or Eastern European towards a much more sustained thinking about the transnational interconnectedness of the global art world. So to give another example that I felt very pleased about, MoMA's display also includes Lynn Hirshman, pioneering video artist who moved through every new development of video work as it was invented. So she made things on video disc. She made the first avatar kind of played or inhabited by Tilda Swinton. A remarkably prescient artist, but lived in San Francisco, technologically innovative, and so a bit of an outlier to art history. Nearly 40 years of practice, ignored outside MoMA, and now finds herself alongside Eduardo Cash, who is the Latin American kind of founder or founding father of computer art. And it's brilliant to see those works as part of MoMA's display. She said, on looking at the opening displays, to Eduardo, look, we have finally found a home. Which I think is a very wry comment from her, since she has presence in many other places around the world. So these much welcome shifts don't mean that we're anywhere near finished. Far from it, I would say. Motion continues. So at Tate, I think we're at the beginning of our next chapter, as many are in the cultural sector. Post-capital phase, but also a post-colonial one, where the questions of whose stories we tell and whose art we find on the walls are debated daily, not just between art historians, but with and through our audiences. So the questions facing us now are how can we connect to an expanded and more diverse audience in our towns and cities, as well as with an audience globally? How also do we meet the future needs of artists who are working in ways that don't behave themselves in terms of the white cube of the gallery? And also, how do we protect and promote the value of this creativity to society. I think it feels at the moment often that we are operating in unprecedentedly tough times. Divisions over Brexit, the economic disparities that produce those kinds of views across the globe, movements of people, continuing conflicts, the rise of both nativist and reactionary nationalist governments, the threat of the global climate emergency. And within our own sector, museums and galleries see the latest iteration of the culture wars, aided by new social media tools and an ever more disputatious and contested public sphere. Sometimes I feel I need a tin hat as a museum director, and it would be easy to retreat. But on the contrary, I want to say that we need to think of this actually as a time of positive, accelerated change. As we wrestle with this greater social and political polarisation, we have also seen the emergence of a confident, popular, ever more political mode of cultural and artistic activity. And it's changing the relationships that institutions like Tate can have with their public. So I've got a few examples. There were swings in my first year at Tate. Danish collective Superflex took over the Turbine Hall and Tate Modern's surrounding public ground. They saw the swings as human turbines, people as energy creators at the heart of a power station. The carpeted slope, which runs up there, was intended to cultivate apathy in a too-fast city, and indeed that did happen. Many tired parents lying down with their children. It explored the potential of the building as a part of a city, open on all sides, with the turbine hall as an indoor street. What this requires is inviting different kinds of people in and making them comfortable that they're allowed to play. I would say in the times that we're living in, and remember that this was the year that Grenfell Towers burnt down, it's a sobering reminder, which was a sobering reminder of the consequences of economic and social inequalities. I think there's a political seriousness and a necessity to the cultivation of joy and play within a city. So far from being an easy spectacle or the art museum as a playground, which perhaps a few grumpy art critics might have said, the Turbine Hall projects like Superflex are as politically engaged as they are participatory. And this year's commission by the African American artist Cara Walker, which some of you may have seen, others not, takes that even further, I think. Fons Americanus remakes for us the Victoria Memorial. Cara saw it from a taxi as she was leaving a site visit at Tate. She was going back to Heathrow and she caught sight of a sculpture, a public sculpture, which was created as monument to empire, with all the paraphernalia and ways in which our public monuments speak about that history. And of course, those of us that live in London and make our way around that part of the city never, ever look at it. It's just the thing you go around, because we don't see that history right in front of us. But a visitor to our country with a different history brings fresh eyes and ultimately a fresh version of this work. So Cara's version tells us the history of the watery continent that unites Africa and the UK and the Americas. She picks up multiple references to the history of colonialism and imperialism, the history of slavery. She nevertheless asks us to sit, as that class of classes of children are, to sit on the edge and relax and play with it. And she even tells us to do this in her playbill for the poster. I think one of the most provocative bits of text we've seen at Tate for a long time. I would point you to the invitation she offers us. Behold the swirling drama of the merciless seas, the prostrate captain, slave and starfish alike. Come one and all to marvel and contemplate, gasp plaintively, sigh mournfully, regard the immaterial void of the abyss in a delightful, family-friendly setting, created by the celebrated negress of the New World, Madam Cara E. Walker, NTY. It's a very challenging bit of writing. It calls up and asks us to question the museums that we're creating. It reminds us of the politics of culture. It uses words that make people feel uncomfortable. We debated long and hard about how people would read that. Would they know who Cara Walker was? Would they see where this is coming from? But actually what we are seeing is that people are willing to sit on the sculpture, and they're also willing to look at the uncomfortable things. And being with that uncomfortableness seems to me vital at the moment. But it isn't only at Tate or across museums in the UK and the world just about changing the collection or the commissions. It has to also be about our exhibitions, our kind of main programmes, if you like, and about the deeper relationship we need to have with our publics. And these are the last two areas I want to come to now. So, two exhibitions will open next year, which I hope you'll come and see, both of them which illustrate an important point for me. As we become an organisation that engages more diverse publics, we are called to do different things. As we become an institution that employs different people, our staff direct us to different things. So we have an amazing LGBTQ+ network across the four Tates. They were responsible in part for the Queer British Art Show at Tate Britain 2 years ago and the Queer and Now Festival. One of the things that they pointed out is that in our contemporary programme, you rarely, if ever, see presence of artists from the communities that they feel themselves to be part of. So Janani Muhuali, one of the really star artists of this year's Venice Biennale, will have a show at Tate Modern next year. And that has come through consistent feedback and evidence gathering from across the staff network who are looking for artists who are demonstrating, if you like, the expanded feel of contemporary art practice. So they are both activists and maker of a new history of images for trans people, particularly on the African continent. This show will sit alongside a Warhol show. Now you might think at that point that is Tate reverting to the known figures of the 20th century, the blockbuster exhibition. And I am sure that it will pull in very large numbers of people. But so will Janani, who had more profile almost than anybody at the subsequent to the Venice Biennale. But the Warhol show that we're doing has this as its lead image, Helen/Harry, one of a series of photographs made by Warhol from a group of people he recruited from a trans club in New York. For the longest time, the subjects of these amazing works were not named or known, but through sustained research by the Warhol Foundation with us at Tate, now all 57 of them are known, and they will form the centrepiece of an exhibition which looks at 1970s and 80s Andy Warhol. So looks at Warhol's work from the perspective of our now. An artist who was engaged with and challenging who was allowed to be represented, who was allowed to be within the artistic mainstream. So it will be a very queer Warhol show, and feels like the right show for Tate to be doing now. In New York last year at the Whitney, they did the most perfect whole career in the encyclopedic show of Andy Warhol. And it's quite right that the Museum of American Art ought to do that, but it wouldn't be right for us at Tate. We need an Andy that speaks to the communities who now come to Tate. So this kind of work really excites me. And the upshot of this collections-based change, programmatic change, the upshot of this kind of attitude is that Tate as an institution, as old as it is now appealing to a younger, more diverse audience. We launched a membership scheme for under 25s last year. Those of you that are under 25, please join. It is free to join online as a Tate Collective member. We did it in part because of criticism from students, like some of you here, who said they couldn't possibly afford to pay £20 for a ticket to go and see something like Warhol. So it's a free online membership, allows you then to have a ticket for yourself and 3 friends for 5 people, and that's the advert over. We hoped we might get 50,000 under 25-year-old members, and we are already a long way over 100,000. A group drawn from them, artists and creators themselves, now curate and produce our Friday Lates at Tate Modern and at Tate Britain. Tate Modern now gets the highest percentage, 21% of black and minority ethnic visitors of any UK museum. For those under 25s, it's nearly 25%. So that's okay. But, as one of my younger staff members said to me, we shouldn't be comparing ourselves with other museums that also don't attract a really diverse audience. She said, we should be comparing ourselves with the world that is around us. And for under 25s in London, black and minority ethnic percentage is 48%. So there is much, much more that we need to do. And that's even before we start to consider the really complex reasons why some people feel that museums and galleries are not for them, which is to do with class and educational background, as well as gender, sexuality, where you live, whether anyone took you when you were a child. All of those things impact on whether people feel that museums are or are not for them. So we're thinking really hard about how we invest in our audience and build it for the future. At Tate Britain at the moment, and this is again something that the public hasn't seen yet, although it has begun to make itself present in the billboards across London, we're doing a project with the British artist Steve McQueen, probably the most famous British artist of current times, given his Hollywood profile as well as his artistic practice. But he went to a primary school in Little Ealing, which is very close to Grenfell, and in the wake of all of that, with us and Art Angel, wanted to make a work that would connect to the 7-year-old that he was in a school photograph that he found in his mother's attic. So we're doing year 3. This is Steve's school photograph. I'll let you find him up there. Steve has worked with us to train a group of school photographers who have attempted to reach every primary school across London. We've ended up getting to just about 70% of them, which is extraordinary. All the educationalists we spoke to said we would be lucky if we got to 50%. It's more than 65,000 7- and 8-year-olds. And they've each been photographed exactly like this with their teachers, and they are currently starring on the Tube network. That's Pimlico. Their photographs have then been taken and turned into a mass artwork that is installed in the Devines Gallery. And as I said, I almost couldn't get in today because all the doors were closed off. The staff are still working to mount every single one of the photographs as the largest creative portrait of the future of London, if not the UK. And again, at the political moment we are at, in the run-up to an election, with all the things we will see and hear, this, to me, speaks to where we need to be. So I'm going to give you a close-up. Some smiling, some not smiling, some hating being photographed, many of them really loving it. It is the every person that London needs to be. And as Steve said, every one of them will become something, will become an artist or an engineer or a tube driver or work in the Tate. But for now, what they know is that they are part of the National Museum and the National Collection. Every child and their teachers is invited, will come to Tate Britain. We've had to build a porta cabin city of toilets in one of our car parks so that we have enough facilities. So they'll come into school and then they're invited back to come with their parents. I hope year 3 will be the beginning, not the only time, they feel themselves to be part of Tate. So the work that we're doing is what do we do over the subsequent 3 years to make sure that they come back and come back and come back. to me, it's about investing in the future of our institution as well as the future of London. But I have one final kind of working example, which is is something that I think is unique to Tate. There were many, many other institutions that are doing amazing projects like this, especially across the UK. But Tate stands nearly alone in having developed a project that's called Tate Exchange. It's a way of saying hello to people differently. It's been unfolding as an idea and a form of practice at Tate Modern and Tate Liverpool for nearly 3 years now. It began with the new building at Tate Modern. Level 5 was dedicated to Tate Exchange, a space where the public and a whole variety of creative practitioners can come into dialogue with one another, make things and talk about art and what it means, and what the world means and what their lives mean. But it's become much more than a level in the building. It's become part of the redefinition of us as an institution. So it's happening now in Liverpool. There are Tate Exchange events or exchange-like events at Tate Britain and Tate St Ives as well. So it's an experiment in changing us as an institution. It aims to generate debate around ideas in art that are relevant. So it's a kind of platform, and it works through the recruitment of associates. So Tate is what it is. We can change and evolve and do all sorts of things, but we are still a large national institution in London and 2 other cities, or a town and a city. We are not a grassroots arts organisation. We are not present in the Welsh Valleys. We are not up in Scotland. But our associates now are. There are 25 partner organisations from the tiny to the large, 25 in Liverpool and 63 at Tate Modern. They range from organisations like the Museum of Homelessness, who hosted an all-night extraordinary event in Tate Modern, to large organisations like the Open University or the University of Fine Arts. And these associates work with us, with a lead artist each year, to explore themes that are participatory explorations of the meaning of culture. So last year rather, the theme was power. This year it's love, which I like very much. The associates work with us to choose the lead artists that they want, and they bring their practices and their audiences into Tate. What it can look like is about debating, but where culture is allowed to happen, who is allowed to shape its meanings. When Claire Toomey, an artist who works often with clay, but not always, came to be the resident artist, she decided she wanted to make a factory for now. Many tons of clay and a 40-metre long production line meant that hundreds of people each day came and made some objects on. They had to clock into the factory, they made their object, then they had to leave it for somebody else. They exchanged what they created. In the second week, the production line stopped and visitors were invited to become part of a factory soundscape and be part of a tour to talk about collective labour. The smallest to the oldest were welcome. And by the third week, they started to evolve some new words for our time through workshops, some of which happened at Tate and some of which happened all across the country. They created banners that they hung in the space. And they said, human labour and its value in the 21st century needed to be about these values: freedom, worth, our humanity, our capacity to engage. And eventually, Claire brought these banners back into Tate. But she said it wasn't really about Tate Exchange on level 5. It was actually about a way in which art can meet people, or society, and then society meets art. And she said, and talked about, in trying to gather the sense of the value of human labour now, it's about starting the creation of an art practice that she is certain will end up on the gallery walls in the future. Most public institutions, like Tate, want to open up and share and extend and include. So we want to do things like this. It's about our cultural relevance now. But the thing that interests me is that when we do that, we don't sit outside society. In fact, we're often, as these values remind us, we're often the barometer of time and space. One of the things that's really interesting for Tate at the moment, and especially Tate Modern, is that the climate emergency is a present topic for artists inside the building and absolute topic for cultural activism outside. So Extinction Rebellion, Culture Declares, they all use our building inside and out because we are a public building. Now I'm sometimes asked if we are allowed to have activists within the building, particularly if they are making declarations which might break the law. But the truth is, if we're an open street, then we are a public avenue and we can't stop that. And because we're part of a dialogue about how the city and how art needs to change. So we are on the move with the debates of our times. And whilst this isn't easy, and it's certainly not easy to be a curator or a museum director or even an artist in these times, I think through these conversations and dialogues, we become more mobile and dynamic. So these examples I've talked about in the second half of my lecture are about the integration of our social and artistic mission. It means we fulfil the requirements of our public funding. Taxpayers' money goes to look after the national collection, we give back to the public. But this is also about building new audiences for the future, as we saw with the Year 3 example. So my vision for all the Tates, the kind of the art history and the art museum that I want for 2020 is a distributed national collection, shared debate about the art we want to see and that we can bring into the collection now, globally connected but locally rooted and relevant. And in doing this, we should be open and generous and connected and in motion, because we need this kind of thinking and practice in the 21st century. Our problems, as I said earlier, are all about social isolation for people, especially elderly people. Worse if you are economically challenged. Museums don't save lives, I don't think, and we need to not be like Victorian missionaries going to save people through our art. But cultural engagement and an expanded space for cultural debate does contribute, I think, to the living of a good life. So it makes us more resilient, it makes us more tolerant, it makes us more mentally well. There's really, really good research that shows that. Actually makes you healthier just to go to a museum. That's my plug for the evening. And I think really importantly, research shows it makes people have a cheerier outlook, even about the tough, uncomfortable things. And this is part of the intrinsic value of museums for all those who are welcomed there, and who will find what they want from our rich and now very varied collections. So I have a last, I've forgotten about that one. This was something written on a banner in Tate Exchange. And it seems to me that that is what we are moving towards. Not the top-down delivery of culture, but a more active engagement with what we need art and culture to be. So I want my institution to be part of the creation of a global art ecology that works to undo hierarchies of exclusion that have so long posited the entirely false idea that there was a single authoritative history of art. That was kind of what I was being taught when I was at university. So I would ask the students in the room, do you find in your studies that you get confirmation of this kind of diversity, or is there more that we still need to do to challenge the canons, to expand what we're talking about? Because certainly when I was a student, I didn't find that confirmation of my life and experience being relevant in the lecture hall. I think here you probably do find that already, and certainly the colleagues I know here are part of the transformation I've been talking about. But what I say, although we do it imperfectly and probably not fast enough for younger generations, I think it's good that our older institutions are being given kind of rocket fuel at the moment in terms of engagement with our ideas. And the institutions are shifting their stories because it's where our public and the artists we work with want to lead us to a more engaged, multivocal, activated art history. So long may it be in motion. Thank you very much, everyone.
Talk with lots of food for thought. We've heard about the integration of the artistic and the social mission of Tate, and we've heard about this idea of the gallery as an expanded space for public debate. So some really rich and exciting ideas for us to take home and perhaps ask questions about now. So the way it's going to work, we've got some time for questions. There should be two people with roving mics. Yes, they're on either side. Thank you. If people can try and catch my eye, I will try and seamlessly orchestrate it so we have a continuous flow of questions or something like that anyway. And if I could just ask you to make sure you speak with the microphone in front of you so we can hear it clearly, and just say something, your name and where you're coming from if that is relevant to your question. Okay, so do we have a first question? We've got one right at the back there. Okay, and the second question. Okay, I think this person here with red top. And then a third one there in blue. Okay, so, over to you.
You talked about the future of, like in the Year 3 project, about the future of London, the future of the arts. And I was just wondering how you feel Tate's involvement, or lack of involvement with students, could change that and influence that. Like, do you think Tate is doing enough for the students in this city and the other cities?
Students in London particularly, or elsewhere?
Just art students in general, because there's a lot of like massive global names, but the future of the arts is in the students. So do you think Tate could do more to invest in that?
I think we could always do more. That's my first statement. But our engagement with the art schools, I think, is more dynamic and active than it's ever been. Partly because of Tate Exchange, but actually also through programmes that take us a long way beyond London, like Artist Rooms, which, that's another plug for the evening. Tate's Artist Rooms exhibition is here in Newcastle at the moment. And that is absolutely about bringing the very highest quality modern and contemporary art to places far outside London, so that young people, and especially students, can benefit from it. We're not a university and we're not a teaching institution ourselves, but we have partnerships with probably 20 of the teaching art school institutions in London and far beyond, so from Falmouth to up into Scotland, out into Wales. And Tate Exchange starts to give a platform for student-led thought and activity. So last summer, some of the students from the University of Fine Arts led a week-long dialogue with our visitors about how hard it was to be a student in a city like London now, and then how even harder it is to establish yourself as an artist. So they staged a debate about what does London need to do to actually help nurture the next generation of artists. And I think that's the kind of right thing for us to do. We can't do everything within the remit of our organisations, but we can provide a space where students can then have both a voice and some creative agency. And I think that's very important.
Okay, thank you.
You talked about Tate being a space, an open space for like specifically environmental protests. How can you justify this when you've previously been sponsored by BP?
Well, we are currently sponsored by BP, and like most institutions, we've gone through periods of sponsorship and moved beyond that. And I think I can't justify the things that happened in the past. I can only talk to you about what we do now. And there isn't a single cultural institution in this country that hasn't had to face a difficult ethical dilemma about where sources of money come from. But I think our ideas about what we do are changing very rapidly, and we've seen successive shifts of position by cultural institutions. But we're not funded fully by the government or by the Mayor's office, so we do have to raise money. But I think we have to be ethical about it, and Tate has an ethics committee that looks at these issues. So I think it's always, we're not perfect. We operate in a very imperfect world, but we are working towards being a good cultural citizen. Thank you.
The gentleman in the blue.
Do I need the mic or can you hear me?
I think it's because
I think other people won't be able to hear you so much.
I don't know quite how to phrase the question, but do you think there's, risk isn't the right word, but do you think that for some audiences, some visitors to the Tate, what they're coming to is not so much a place to see art, but a tourist destination? Something to be ticked off in the same way that visitors to Paris might go to the Louvre, or the Guggenheim in Bilbao, or MoMA. And if that is the case, does that influence the kind of programmes you feel obliged to present to those audiences?
No, I don't think so. In that, I would say there's a lot of rooms across the four Tates and a lot of spaces. I'm sorry, I'm going to mention my son again, but when I took him to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa, he was gigantically disappointed because it's quite a long queue and it's very small, and he found much more interesting work in the Renaissance galleries, which were practically empty. Now, there isn't really any part of Tate that is absolutely empty, but whilst we need a kind of an open door and a welcome, and I want us to feel part of the city, or part of the cities and towns that we're in, you go up the escalators and walk through the artists and studios displays to a really fine room of surrealist and post-surrealist works, and actually you'll have as much time as you want to look at those particular works. So I think we can be multivalent and speak to many audiences at once. The people who come in at 10 o'clock to see a major exhibition just as it opens, so the rooms are as empty as they'll be all day, are a very different demographic to those who come on a Friday night and actually want to be part of a large crowd. But I think even that large crowd are there because it's an art space. They're not there because it's kind of nowhere. Because there's something very particular about being in a space where a lot of thought has gone into your visual surroundings. So I think we can be quite, in fact, the evidence of the growing audiences at Tate Britain or Tate Modern or Tate Liverpool is that actually people are really daring. They'll come and see things they don't know, as long as they feel welcomed. And so to me, people can come in because they like the cafe. That's really fine. But on their way to their cafe, they'll see something that surprises them. And I think that's a good balance.
I suppose just to follow up on that question, it would be interesting to know what proportion of the visitors to Tate are international tourists and what are, domestic visitors, and whether that, I suppose leading on from that, whether that does shape the way that you think about your audience and your programme.
At Tate Modern, it's nearly 50% international tourists, but then it's a big building and it can accommodate that quite easily. And people come in and they go up to the viewing platform or they'll go out to the cafes. And because there's a lot of international tourists, in some ways, again, it can allow you to be more adventurous with the programming. So you'll see over the last couple of years and into the future, consistent showing of Eastern European work. It's fun, we get a lot of Russian and Polish visitors, and lots of work from displays and exhibitions that are exploring Latin America or South Asia. But again, that's speaking to both local audiences and visitors. And so even with a large tourist audience, it's not preventing us be sort of expanding the kinds of things that people will come to see. And often it's about the choreography of a programme. So you might have a Picasso 1932 show on, but it's sitting alongside Kabakov's exhibition. People come for one thing and end up going to another, which is good, I think.
So programming simultaneously for multiple audiences.
Yeah.
So I think then crossover.
Yeah. And I should say as well, I think also audiences always exceed our expectations because we have quite crude, rubbishy ways of understanding them. So my working example of that at the moment is that Tate Britain has got a William Blake show on, which of course is the historic show. But Blake's a revolutionary, and at the moment it's thronged with young people. It's been brilliantly successful with the Tate collective audience, and I think it is because of the political times. You know, he was not going to be confined by the way art had been and the way political thinking was. So it feels very relevant.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Maria. That was brilliant. And I just should fess up that I am actually a Tate trustee, so I'm a little bit biased on this front. But just to say that, yes, Tate Collective is really innovative, and it is something that, I'm coming back to the point about whether it's relevant for students and how students actually feel they're benefiting. You know, it speaks to an audience. It speaks to an audience of young people, and it really talks to them directly about where they matter. So I think that's very key, even if it doesn't transpire straight through to education. It's talking about the generations. That's very important. And also just to add in terms of ethics as well, I mean, there has been some key questions that we've debated in terms of looking at the Sackler bequest, which obviously is a major issue, and also a human rights issue, and also sadly a lot of people have suffered from that. And Tate has actually, you know, distanced itself and removed itself from that. So just to add that it is very, very aware and very conscious about what the big issues are in terms of where we situate ourselves. But finally, just to say that in terms of thinking about museums or cultures and seeing civic space, the most invisible part where our museums sit, but yet every architect talks about the building, but they don't talk about the place in front of the building, which is the civic space. That's what's really key about seeing an institution like a museum travel outside and bring you in. And you know, it's a very obvious thing, but that's something that's been very positive about all of what's happened through Tate and through Tate Modern.
Yeah.
The microphone seems to be not working so well. Are we going to swap it? No. Could you pass it back? Is it not working, Martin?
I think it's off. The other clock's on.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we'll improvise it. So I'll just paraphrase a little bit there. The comment was about Tate Collective, and then about ethics and the Sackler bequest, and also the importance of the gallery of civic space and the space outside of it as well. So I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, and I mean, I'll respond to that last one. Tate Liverpool is on the docks, and it's a nicer route from the city centre out to the docks these days because the whole of Liverpool city centre has been connected up better and regenerated rather. In my day, it was a very, very long, windy walk to get down there. But still, it's quite a way, and in the last 18 months, with the Liverpool Biennial, the team there commissioned and brought in a piece of public art by Ugo Rondinoni. It's called the Liverpool Mountain, and it's a series of extremely large, neon-luminous rocks piled up as a column. And you can see it from about half a mile away. And what I've really enjoyed in the last 9 months of visiting is as I walk through Liverpool One, which is the big shopping centre that's been created, you hear people say, "Oh, I'll meet you by the rocks." And that's sort of one of the functions of art, that it becomes a cultural and emotional landmark for people. And it changes the horizon, quite literally. You look out onto the Mersey now, and there's this peculiar, amazing artistic disruption. And it immediately makes the space around it social. And so you talk to a person that you don't know about, from what the hell is this? I like this artist's work. All of those reactions and everything in between are really, really important because they are about creating an expanded social space. And I think it's really important at a time when our cities are also being carved up as increasingly privatised spaces. But as public museums that are free to get in, we kind of hold on to the public space around us and make it for people.
Thank you. Andrew, I'll come back to you in a moment. This lady here was ready.
I hope this doesn't show my age and be taken as a reactionary question, but what role do you see for the Tate in exhibiting living British painters?
We have a huge role. Painting is resurgent at the moment. So at Tate Britain currently, last year we had the All Too Human show, which took the School of London and brought it up to date. So the last 3 rooms were all living artists currently working in painting. We'll be doing a show with Lynette Badham-Boakye. We've got amazing displays across the 20th century galleries of some of our great still living 20th century artists, worked by people like Kossoff and others. And we just had a Lisa Bryce show in the Art Now area. She's originally South African, now definitely British painter, again working in London. So I think there's a renewed interest by the public and presence in our collection. And so we're just looking at work by Michael Armitage, another young London-based painter. So I think we're not downgrading painting in any way at all. And the British art collection, which spans 500 years, has a national responsibility to make sure that across any year or any decade we are showing the art that's being made of our time.
You've talked very inspiringly about the work you're doing to engage new audiences and promote creativity in Britain, particularly in London and in Liverpool, but in other places too. And you talked about the way that you're collecting work from across the world. Do you think Tate also has a role and a responsibility to promote new audiences and promote creativity internationally, and particularly in countries where there aren't so many opportunities?
Yeah, I think we do, in very particular ways. I mean, we see at the moment across the globe the expansion of museums and established museums developing outposts. You know, the Guggenheim started that in Bilbao, but if you look in the Gulf at the moment, you have the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, the Pompidou are developing a space in Shanghai. And I don't think that's a wise route for now. And what I think is much more productive is sharing our knowledge and artistic projects and having an exchange model. So a kind of an expanded version of Tate Exchange, but globally. So Tate supports a number of regional acquisition committees. So the works that have come into the collection from Africa, from Asia Pacific, from South Asia, from Latin America, and from Russia and Eastern Europe have come through the creation of communities of interest, people who collect, who are scholars, or who are supporters of the arts in those regions. And we have curators attached to them who lead research thinking. And ultimately, it expands our knowledge of fields which were, until recently, quite unfamiliar to us. And they help bring works into the collection. But it means we travel around the globe. So if I look a bit dark circles into my eyes, it's because I flew back from Lagos overnight just a couple of days ago. Because our African Acquisitions Committee were at the Lagos Biennial, Tate curators, myself were there, helping to support the arts ecology that is evolving very rapidly there. So we lend our expertise, and also we're learning from people, so it's reciprocal. If we're working in China, it's more likely to be in terms of developing, helping them develop an ethos and ethics of public museum work, rather than just the proliferation of private museums. So I think as long as we understand it as learning on both sides, we have a real responsibility to share what we have and know. And we also have loads to gain from that. And I mean, in the simplest terms, our exhibitions tour all over the world. In fact, the most attended Tate exhibition ever was in Beijing last year, which was a Turner show, which is very pleasing. Not Beijing, Shanghai. When Shanghai was higher than Beijing, it went to Beijing.
Yes.
What does the Tate do to ensure inclusion of refugees and asylum seekers in terms of more practical issues such as labels and introductory texts?
Yeah. And there's been quite a body of work around this, in part because one of the other themes of Tate Exchange was movement, and particularly migrations of people. But also the Cuban artist Tanya Vergara spent nearly 12 months working with us towards producing a turbine hall installation, and through that engaged and supported a number of newly arrived people and refugees who were in the immediate footprint of Tate Modern. And so there were partnerships with the groups that helped support them. Again, rather like working with the Museum of Homelessness or with Young People's Park, we're not an agency that can solve those problems, but we can be a platform and a space that helps support networks of people and other organisations. And rather like the climate emergency, it is a topic that artists are grappling with all the time, so it isn't separate from us. The Turner Prize exhibition that's on at the moment features work by Lawrence Abu Hamdan and Oscar Murillo, as well as Tai Shanay and Helen Chamak. And two of the works are explicitly about the experience of displacement and condition of refugee, and the other two works are also really about those pressing issues. So we do what I think is right for an artist, an arts organisation, in that we have to be welcoming, our staff are trained to support, but there also are specific programmes that will deal with the issues that people in communities face.
This gentleman here.
You mentioned...
Oh, just one second.
There's a mic coming through. Yeah.
You mentioned Steve McQueen and his Hollywood work and his artistic work. Steve doesn't make a distinction there.
No, he doesn't. No, I meant we know many more people know his name because of 12 Years a Slave, but you're absolutely correct. He does not make a distinction between that and any one of the works that are in Tate's collections.
Okay.
So, does that raise the question about bringing in the popular and the mainstream?
So do you mean in the sense that should, for example, 12 Years a Slave be in Tate's collection or be shown in Tate?
Or The Widows, or the other films?
Yeah. We did. Well, we showed Widows. We had a preview in the Star Cinema at Tate Modern. But the answer to that really is our cinema's not big enough. But it was for a special preview that was for Steve. So critically and artistically, we don't make a distinction. Practically, we just don't have the West End cinemas are a much better place to see his very large-scale films.
I think we've come to the end of the time for the questions. I'm sure we could have kept going for quite a bit longer. But thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much for coming and talking to us, especially after your recent flight. It's been great, and we will watch with interest to see the continuing activities that are taking. Thank you.